Clara set the water jug on the kitchen table as the radio played an old Waco song softly. Outside, the Texas heat was already beating down early. Her husband, Walter, a Special Forces veteran, had driven the truck into town. It was just another ordinary morning on the ranch, until the silence began to weigh heavily. No roosters crowing, no barking. When Clara looked out the window and saw the wide-open back fence, her premonition turned into certainty. 3 men were approaching the barn with slow steps, dirty smiles, and guiltless eyes. One of them lifted an iron pipe and said, "Quiet, ma'am." She froze. She trembled. But what those bandits didn't know is that Clara carried a silent past, a trained past, a lethal past. And in that moment, something began to awaken inside her. Something that even she herself didn't know still existed. Because what was to come, no one in the town of Abbott would ever forget. She tried to control her breathing, but her chest seemed to be getting heavier by the second. Sweat trickled down the back of her neck, mixing with the fine dust from the wooden floor. Her hands were still holding the jar, which was now shaking. One of the men kicked the back door brutally, making the silverware on the table vibrate. Clara said nothing. She just watched. Every step, every movement. Inside, her heart begged for this to be a nightmare. But it wasn't. They surrounded her like fragile prey. One of them laughed softly, whispering something dirty. Another picked up the picture of her and Walter and dropped it, shattering the glass. Clara looked at the shards on the floor, and there, in the broken eyes of the picture, she saw herself years ago, when she was still just a woman trying to understand the silence of a veteran. And now, she was the one learning to survive within her own silence. She felt her eyes water, but she didn't give in. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, because in that moment, she understood that if she didn't do anything, there would be nothing left. If this kind of story touches you in any way, if you've ever felt the weight of being underestimated or seen someone face the impossible with courage, leave a comment below with what moved you the most so far. Your voice matters. And when you like this video or subscribe to the channel, you're helping this message reach other people who need to hear it too. People like Clara, people who seem fragile, but carry an entire universe inside. Because what happened next, no one was prepared to see. The man who walked toward the barn walked slowly, kicking his feet on the dry ground as if he knew exactly where he was stepping. He thought it was just another ranch in the middle of nowhere, and that Clara was just another country wife, the kind of woman who despairs, cries, screams. He was wrong, completely wrong. Inside, Clara kept her body still, but her mind alert. His every step outside echoed like a drum inside her chest. Her nails pressed against the wood of the chair, trying to ease the pain in her wrists, marked by the duct tape. But there was no relief. The 2 men who remained inside the house continued talking loudly, making jokes. One of them lit a cigarette and dropped ashes on the embroidered rug that Clara's mother had given her for their wedding anniversary. The other went through the drawers, turning everything over, throwing objects on the floor that held too many stories to fit into a single sentence. With each laugh, something inside her broke, and yet, on the outside, she wouldn't give in. Her gaze was fixed, almost apathetic. She seemed defeated, but her mind was calculating to the millimeter. They didn't know that, at the base of the chair where she was tied, there was a small blade embedded under the wood. An old gift from Walter, hidden like so many other things in that house. With smooth, controlled movements, Clara began to rub her wrist against the edge of the blade, feeling her skin burn as the tape was slowly, almost imperceptibly cut. Outside, the barnman finally found what he shouldn't have. A dry shot rang out. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a shot. A muffled scream. The trap Walter had set months earlier as training was still there. And Clara knew it. Tensioned wire, snap clips, and a makeshift lever made from a tractor part. Anyone who stepped on the exact spot would have their leg trapped, with no chance of escaping on their own. That's what happened. The screams came seconds later. The sound of a body struggling. Chaos erupting outside. Inside the house, the 2 men got up in a hurry. One ran to the balcony. The other went towards the kitchen, but stopped. The chair where Clara had been. It was empty. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. His gaze swept the room in desperation. He grabbed the pistol from his belt and began to walk slowly, calling out the woman's name as if he were still in control. But he was no longer. Clara had already moved to the back of the house, silent as a shadow. She pulled a short shotgun from the wood box, which Walter always left there, just in case. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her finger off the trigger. For now. Meanwhile, the man on the porch shouted orders into the wind, trying to understand what had happened to his friend. He didn't notice that Clara was already in the shadows on the side of the barn, watching everything with cold eyes. The blood on the floor already traced the trail of their defeat. All that was needed was one false move, and the game would change for good. But deep down, Clara still didn't know if she could go all the way, because she wasn't a murderer. She was a wife, a woman who just wanted to take care of the chickens, make breakfast, and wait for Walter to come back with the tractor part. She didn't ask for any of that. But life sometimes puts us on a battlefield we didn't choose. And when the man inside the house began to search the room more aggressively, kicking furniture and shouting swear words, Clara saw a crooked picture through the crack in the window. It was a photo of her and Walter, right after their wedding. He in a uniform. She in a simple dress, but with that nervous smile of someone who didn't know if she could live with someone who had been through hell. The memory hit hard. That night, Walter woke up in the middle of a nightmare and accidentally pushed her. She fell off the couch. He cried like a child afterwards. He asked for forgiveness 1,000 times, and it was there, on that cold floor, that he said, "I never want to hurt you again. So, I'm going to teach you everything I know, so that one day you'll never need anyone to defend you. Not even me." She remembered those words as if they had been said yesterday. She remembered the first shot at the makeshift training camp. She remembered the pain in her shoulders, the bruises, Walter's shouts that sometimes mixed instruction and trauma. She remembered everything, and that didn't weaken her. On the contrary. It was what now kept her feet firmly on the ground. The tension mounted again when the man inside the house heard a crack in the hallway. He walked over slowly, aiming his gun. The bedroom door was ajar. He pushed it open with the barrel of his gun. Nothing, just silence. That's when a shadow passed behind him. Clara, quick, instinctive movement, shot with the butt of the gun to the shoulder. He tried to turn, but fell under the weight of the impact. The gun slid across the floor and landed under the dresser. She stared at him for a second, panting. They both looked at each other. He laughed, spitting blood. "You're just a crazy housewife." But Clara didn't answer. She just bent down, picked up the pistol, and took 3 steps back, with it in her hand. At that moment, outside, a distant siren began to wail. Someone, probably a neighbor, had called the police about the screams. What would come next was yet to happen. But Clara, there on that floor, understood that something inside her had already changed. And there was no turning back. If you got this far and this story touched some part of you, comment below. Strength comes from silence. Because sometimes it is in the quietest hours that courage awakens with the most fury. The man screamed like a wounded animal, the sound cutting through the silence of the property like a knife through leather. The trap had snapped shut with brute force, crushing his shin against a piece of rusty iron that Walter had adjusted months before. Part of an old training, a lesson in territory and defense. Clara, who had never imagined needing it, now saw each lesson become real survival. The other 2 ran toward the barn, driven by desperation. One of them slipped in his haste, soiling his shirt with dirt and dried blood. The other pulled the injured man by the collar, trying to free his trapped leg, but he had no idea how it worked. Meanwhile, Clara's gaze followed each of their movements, from the top of the tool shed, where she was crouched, almost invisible among bales of feed and the suffocating heat of the Texas summer. The gun was still in her hands. It was heavy. It was heavy, not just because of the iron, but because of the meaning. It was the same rifle Walter had used to ward off coyotes. Now it was a fine line between instinct and trauma. Clara didn't want to kill anyone, but she also wasn't going to let them invade the only peace she had worked so hard to build with the man she loved. The two bandits shouted at each other, nervous, losing control of the situation. They still thought they were hunting. They didn't realize that they had already become prey. Arrogance gave way to fear, and Clara knew that fear well. She saw that same look in Walter's eyes in the early hours of the morning when he would wake up in a cold sweat, speaking in code, looking for the gun that was no longer within reach. She carefully climbed down from the structure and walked around the side of the shed. The light filtered through the wooden cracks and illuminated parts of her face. Tense eyes, pent-up breathing. The expression of someone who was not only surviving, but protecting everything that was valuable. She walked behind one of the bandits, who had his back turned, trying to free his wounded friend. She cocked the gun slowly, but an empty can fell from the top of a cupboard, attracting the attention of the other. He turned, saw the figure, and shouted, "There! That's her!" The two split up. One ran to the right side of the barn. The other stayed behind, dragging his bleeding friend. Clara, agile, hid behind a pile of hay. Each second seemed to last an eternity. The smell of sweat and metal filled the air. She waited for the right moment. When the first of them appeared behind the broken tractor, she pointed. "Stop," he said firmly. He hesitated. He had a knife in his hands, stained with grease. She saw that his eyes no longer held arrogance. They held fear. "You won't shoot," he taunted. "Maybe not," she replied, "but maybe only I know the way back so you can get out alive." He couldn't believe it. He took 2 steps. She fired a shot past his head. The noise deafened the structure. He fell to his knees, shaking. The other tried to get up, pulling his unconscious friend. But Clara had already disappeared again, as if she were part of the environment. It was what Walter always taught. Disappear. Make the enemy believe he is safe. And then take away his peace. Clara crossed the back of the property along the trail that led to the sparse forest. She knew they would try to escape. She just needed to control her path. The sun was beating down on her face, burning. Fatigue was already weighing on her legs, but there was something bigger guiding her steps. A conviction. A code that only veterans understand. And she was part of it now. As she walked through the cornfield, she heard a noise, one of them running along the side. She crouched down, crawled to the fence, and set a trap with a piece of rope and an old fallen beam. Time was short, the risk was great, but instinct was guiding every decision. Suddenly, a crash, a short scream. It worked. She ran over and saw the second man trapped, his leg twisted, lying on his side, his face scratched. He tried to drag himself away, but he was groaning in pain. "What are you?" he asked through gritted teeth. She didn't answer. She just took his gun and followed. There was still one left. The last one was in the house. She knew it. And he was armed. She walked back across the field, exhaustion taking hold. Her arm ached. Her mouth was dry. But her focus was absolute. Clara opened the door slowly, listening carefully to every sound. Footsteps up the stairs, into the bedroom. She climbed the stairs cautiously. The floor creaked. Sweat ran down her back. She reached the hallway and saw his shadow in the mirror at the end of the room. His back was turned. Clara pointed the shotgun, her finger on the trigger, but her body froze. It was then that she remembered the most painful moment of her journey, the day when Walter, at the height of a crisis, pointed his gun at his own mirror. He shouted names, numbers, orders. She hugged him from behind, crying. He fell to his knees and said, "The worst enemy in war is the one inside us." She felt that enemy now, and she needed to defeat him there, standing in the same place where so many memories had been built. The man turned slowly, saw the gun, and raised his hands. "I just wanted money, girl," he said, stuttering. She took a deep breath. She lowered the shotgun and said, Get out of my house, and pray you never cross paths with me again." He ran. He stumbled. He ran into the field, and he disappeared. Clara finally fell to the ground, sitting down. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body felt heavy, but inside, a flame was burning. A silent transformation, a mentality that cannot be learned from books. She had crossed the line between fear and dominance, and she would never be the same. If you felt this change in your soul, write in the comments. Now I understand her strength. This helps the story live on, because every word we share has the power to heal someone. And what was yet to come, no one could have imagined. Clara remained there, kneeling on the dry ground, her knees dug into the mud mixed with corn husks and fragments of a day that should never have started like this. The silence after the impact seemed to mock her conscience. She had knocked a man down. Not in training, not in theory. It was real. The smell of fresh blood, mixed with the heat of the ancient wood, triggered memories she didn't even know she had. Her eyes burned, but she wasn't crying. She was just breathing heavily. Her mouth was half open, trying to suck in the air that seemed to be missing. For a moment, it wasn't the ranch anymore. It wasn't Texas anymore. It was another place. A place where pain came before words, where fear was routine. A field she had never physically stepped foot in, but that had been planted in her mind by years of living with Walter. Her mind, now, was going through the backstage of everything that had been hidden. The dirty truth of every mission that he could never tell. She struggled to her feet. Her legs were shaking. The shotgun slipped from her hand and fell with a thud. Her body felt like it wanted to give up, but something deeper, more primal, was pulling her back to the surface. There was one last man left, and now he had the advantage. His words echoed like a threat. "I have a hostage." But who? There was no one else in the house besides her. Unless... no. She ran to the back room, where neighbors sometimes left their children while they ran errands in town, and her heart nearly stopped. There was Ellie. The 8-year-old girl, wide-eyed, sat in the corner of her little room, with her hands tied together and a t-shirt stuffed in her mouth. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her feet. The world spun. Ellie was the daughter of Emily, the grocery store woman in Abbott. She always left a note pinned to the kitchen door. "Thanks, Clara. She's calmer with you." But now the girl was shaking. Her face was dirty. Her cheeks were streaked with dried tears. And the gun! The last man's gun was pointed straight at her head. "One step, ma'am. Just one step, and I swear..." Clara raised her hands slowly. She was unarmed now. Her whole body screamed in despair. But her face, steady. Just like Walter taught her. Just like she had learned the hard way. "Look at me, Ellie," he said in a low voice. The girl couldn't. She cried. "I'm going to get you out of here. But I need you to trust me." The man laughed. "Are you going to trust me? You are unarmed. It's over. You are nobody." That phrase, "you are nobody," hit him deeper than he could have imagined, because Clara had already believed it for many years. When the city treated her as the wife of the strange soldier, when the eyes of others only saw her fragility on the outside and ignored what she faced inside her home on long nights of heavy silence. And even so, she stayed. She loved, she learned, she carried on. And in that moment, she felt that everything she had experienced had prepared her for this. He closed his eyes for a second. He took a deep breath. Then he looked deep into the man's eyes. "If you pull that trigger, no one will get out of here. Not even you." He hesitated, quickly, but it was enough. The girl moved her legs, a noise on the floor. The man instinctively turned his head, and Clara stepped forward. The impact was brutal, body against body. They both fell to the ground. The gun skidded. Ellie screamed. Clara fought with everything she had, her hands grabbing his arms, trying to immobilize him. But he was bigger, heavier. He tried to choke her with his forearm. Her face turned purple. Her breath was gone. And it was at that moment that something gleamed on the side of the carpet. The ceremonial dagger that Walter kept on the altar in his room. A gift from a war buddy. Clara saw it. She reached out. Her fingers trembled. The tip of her fingernail touched the hilt. And she pulled. The cut was clean. Precise. The man screamed. He pulled away. He staggered. Clara rolled to the side, choking. When she stood up, he was already on his knees, pressing his shoulder. The gun was lying behind him. She didn't pick it up. She just stared. "Get out of my house," he said, his voice cracking. He didn't argue. He just ran, stumbling, disappearing out the back door. Clara's body collapsed immediately afterward, but Ellie ran to her and hugged her from behind. Their cries mingled into a sound that seemed to finally break the heavy silence that had reigned over the farm since sunrise. Minutes later, sirens began to sound in the distance. Clara knew that was the end of the invasion. But what she didn't know yet was what that day had awakened inside her. Something that neither time, nor pain, nor even war could erase. Write in the comments. I also found my strength in chaos. Because there are people who only discover what they are made of when everything around them falls apart. The wood of the porch creaked under the weight of the slow-passing minutes. Clara sat, but she wasn't resting. The rifle rested on her thighs, her fingers still firmly on the barrel, as if she didn't know what to do with her own hands now that it was all over. The Texas sky was beginning to turn a dirty orange, streaked with heavy clouds. The sirens, approaching in waves, sounded familiar, but far removed from the reality she had just lived. Red and blue lights streaked across the field like ghosts. The police cars screeched to a halt. Doors opened. Armed men got out, shouting commands, but Clara didn't move. She didn't need to. She just slowly raised her free hand and nodded toward the house. 2 police officers rushed in. Others spread out across the area. Within minutes, the scene of the violence was being mapped out by quick voices and hurried footsteps. But no one approached her right away. It was as if the image of that woman, with worn boots, a dirty face, and eyes fixed on the horizon, generated a kind of respect that was not taught in academia. It was the sheriff who came first. A big man with a grey beard and the look of someone who had seen a lot, but never this. Mrs. Mayfield? Clara nodded, without turning her face. Are you hurt? She shook her head, even though her soul told her otherwise. The sheriff took a deep breath. He looked at the shotgun, then at the half-open door. Inside, there are 3 men. One of them didn't survive. She didn't answer. What happened here? Was it self-defense? She slowly turned her eyes to him. They taught me how to survive, Sheriff. And that's what I did. The man swallowed hard and took off his hat. It wasn't fear. It was reverence. Meanwhile, a young police officer came out with Ellie in her arms. The girl was sobbing with exhaustion and trauma, but when she saw Clara, she stretched out in the officer's arms. She's the one who saved me, he said, his voice hoarse. Clara opened her arms. The policewoman hesitated, then handed the girl over. Ellie clung tightly to her neck, as if the world had come together again. The 2 stayed like that for minutes, the girl calming down. Clara finally letting out a little less heavy air. Then a familiar sound came from the distance. Not sirens, not radios. It was an engine. The engine of Walter's blue pickup truck. Clara looked up and saw the cloud of dust rising up the gravel road. Her chest tightened. For a second, she thought about hiding everything, cleaning the house, pretending nothing had happened. But that was no longer possible. The truth was spread across every corner of the property, and inside her. Walter got out of the car slowly. He stopped when he saw the police cars, the police officers, the yellow tape, the body covered by a sheet, and Clara, with Ellie in her arms, the shotgun still nearby. He walked with heavy steps to the porch. He climbed the steps without saying a word. He stood before her, his eyes roaming over every detail of the face of the woman he thought he knew inside and out. Are you okay? She just shook her head, her gesture restrained. Her mouth didn't want to open. Her eyes were moist, not from fear, but from a pride that hurt. He slowly lowered himself and sat down next to her. He ran his hand over her back. They were both silent. Ellie was asleep, leaning against Clara's shoulder. After a while, Walter spoke. I spent my whole life trying to get the war out of me, and without realizing it, I taught you how to survive it. She looked at him for the first time since he'd arrived, and there, in the reflection of his gaze, she saw herself in a new way. Not as a survivor, but as part of something bigger, a woman who had come through the impossible and remained whole. You didn't teach me war, Walter, he said in a low voice. You taught me not to be invisible, and today, no one will treat me as if I were. He smiled sideways, with tears in his eyes, and then he hugged her for real. Tight, with both arms. As if he knew that that moment needed to be engraved in her memory as something that no trauma could steal. There, under the hot Texas sky, amid the smell of gunpowder and dust, a new truth was born. Clara was no longer just a veteran's wife. She was a legend. And yet, there was one last thing to be said. A detail that no one knew. A gesture that Walter would make in silence. But that would reveal much more than any words. Write in the comments, I saw courage born in silence. Because there are battles that we win, without having to shout. The next morning, the ranch was silent again. But it wasn't the same silence. It was the kind of calm that came after a storm, carrying a strange weight, as if the ground itself was still trying to figure out what had happened. Clara was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hair tied up in a mess, her hands resting on her knees. He was wearing an old shirt of Walter's. His nails still had marks of dirt, and his eyes, even rested, held something new. A firmness that didn't need to be explained. Walter entered the room with light steps, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her without saying anything. The gesture said what words could not. They looked at each other for a moment, and there was a silent recognition. Not only for what had happened, but for everything that had been overcome to get to that moment. But soon the landline phone in the kitchen started ringing. Clara walked down slowly. Each step felt firmer than before. She answered the phone, her voice still low. Mayfield? It was the sheriff. Clara, I know it's early, but the press doesn't stop. And the mayor wants to know if you would accept a public tribute. A ceremony, a city medal of honor, that kind of thing. Clara looked out the window. She saw the fields still wet with dew, the shed in the background, and the tree trunk where Ellie was drawing with a piece of charcoal. He thought for a few seconds. No, Sheriff. Thank you. I didn't do it to make headlines. I understand. But just so you know, there are people in the city who are starting to look differently at what you represent. She smiled, but it was a discreet smile, like someone who understands the impact of a decision, but doesn't let herself be carried away by it. When he hung up the phone, Walter was already on the porch. He was cleaning his shotgun, not out of paranoia, but like someone taking care of something that, even though painful, was part of his own salvation. Clara approached. Do you remember the first time you taught me to shoot? Walter nodded. I cried out of fear. I remember. He stopped moving for a second. But even though you were crying, you pulled the trigger. She sat down beside him. It wasn't the shot that changed me, Walter. It was what I felt afterward. The weight, the noise, the memory of what it could mean. It made me understand what you've always carried on your shoulders. Walter looked out at the field, his eyes slightly moist. The war inside us never ends, Clara. We just learn to walk with it. And it was at that moment that Clara took something out of her pocket. A thin chain with a golden star-shaped pendant. It was the only gift her father had left her before he died. A man she had barely known, but who had always been described as too firm, too hard. I found this yesterday, near the barn. She held the pendant between her fingers. And I realized that maybe I was born with more strength than I realized. I just needed to be tested. Walter took the pendant and closed it in her hand. You have not been tested. You have been revealed. These words touched something deep, a hidden truth that not even Clara could put into words, because there were forces that only appeared when there was no way out. Forces that came from pain, loss, love, and fear at the same time. And when all of this mixed together, a silent courage was born. Little by little, the neighbors began to appear. First, it was the McGee couple, bringing apple pie. Then Emily came, with Ellie in her arms. The girl ran down and hugged Clara by the legs, as if that were the only safe place in the world. Behind her, more people. Some with flowers, others with words. But all with their eyes downcast, humble. It wasn't curiosity. It was respect. And it was there, on that worn-out porch, that the real transformation happened. Not on the day of the attack. Not when the shooting happened. But in that moment, when the community quietly recognized that strength doesn't always come from noise, and that sometimes the woman who seemed the weakest in the city was the one holding it all together. Walter stepped back, leaving Clara in front. She was the one with the steady gaze now, the erect posture, the presence. No one needed to defend Clara anymore. She had already defended herself, and others. And in Walter's pants pocket, there was still something hidden, an old envelope. Addressed to Clara, handwritten by himself years ago during one of his worst crises. An apology, an explanation, an acknowledgement that she deserved better. But he never had the courage to hand it over. Now perhaps was the time. Write in the comments. I chose not to be invisible, because sometimes it's the decision not to go out that turns on the light in the darkest places. If you've made it this far, it's because this story has touched you in some way. Maybe because you know someone like Clara, or maybe because deep down, you're also discovering your own strength in the midst of silence. If this journey made sense to you, leave a comment with the phrase, "I saw truth in this story." It's the simplest and most powerful way to show me that this message reached you. Take advantage and leave a like if all this connected you with something real in there. This helps the content to stay alive and to reach those who also need to hear it. And if you like this type of narrative that mixes emotion, courage, and redemption, subscribe to the channel. With each story, we walk together along paths that many people experience, but few have the courage to tell. There is a video here that completes this reflection in a special way. Click and continue with me there. There is another story waiting for you.